I'm extremely excited to get us started. So welcome everybody for our tech talk from Ken, who is one of our former board members. He is a global expert in standards. I'm going to read you his bio, and then we're going to get started. Ken is a former Internet Society San Francisco Bay Area board member and global standards expert. Ken started his technical career working as an engineer for several electronics companies in the 1960s and 70s. After founding one electronics company and working in sales and marketing for 3 others, he began standards consulting in 1980. Ken has served as a lecturer at the University of Colorado Boulder, the other UC, program chair of the Standards and Information Technology Conference in 5 countries. He was the founding technical editor of the Communications Standard Review and served with them from 1990 to 2002. The paper that this talk, The Role of Technical Standards in Enabling the Future, is based on, was included in the National Academy of Engineering's renowned journal, The Bridge's 50th anniversary edition this past February. You can read more of Ken's papers, thoughts, and other ways that you can get involved in standards work at his website, isology.com. I will now stop sharing and hand it over to you, Ken. How are you doing today, Ken?
I'm wonderful. Thank you so much. And let
Wonderful.
me see if I can start sharing.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
All right. That might be it.
I can't see your screen yet, but I'm sure we will in just a moment. There we go. Perfect.
There we go.
Thank you.
Okay, okay, we got it?
You're all good, good to go.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, well, everyone, good afternoon, and thank you for having me. The SFBay ISOC, I was actually a founding member of, and I've enjoyed participating in it for all these years. It's an excellent organization, mostly because, from my perspective, it supports standards and standardization. The difficulty we're going to have here starting out is the concept of standards is really thought of as a practice. And I am proposing with this lecture and many papers in the past that isology is the study of both the theory of standards and the practice. And what I hope to do today is to offer you some idea of the theory of standards and how it impacts the practice. Obviously, without a theory, practice becomes memorization, which is, for most of us is neither useful nor helpful. So let me move forward. Oops, not having it. Oh, there we go. Try that. There we go. So the internet is basically a pile of standards. There is the lower layer standards, which are called in this picture are the communication standards, Wi-Fi, cellular, Ethernet, many different variations of each of those. There's various other standards involved as well. And then kind of in the middle, there's the IP standards, the Internet Protocol. And then slightly above that is the TCP, UDP protocols, which connect, and we'll talk about this in more detail, the applications at each end of the system. And then above those, the actual applications run. And I'll be more specific about how this works in a moment. But I should give credit where credit is due. And this particular idea of the internet as an hourglass, many communication standards, many applications, all linked together by a common TCP, UDP, and IP protocol sets. It comes from David Clark, who was one of the early workers on the internet. So here's what the concept of layered communications. And so an important idea here is that layering is fundamental to what we call information. Without it, we have data, but we have no real concept of that data. It's just kind of something. But with layering, we can start to describe data in some kind of structure. And generally speaking, we talk about communications in layers. The 7 OSI layers are as shown on the left. The internet layers, the 5 internet layers, are shown on the right. And again, all information is layered. Your DNA is a set of layers of information that describes proteins and parts of genomes and RNA and all sorts of different intermediate layers. And even evolution with all the species is again a form of layered information. To put this into some more current perspective, you'll notice that the internet layers do not include session or presentation. And the reasons for that are several, and the effects of that are several. I'll go into. The session layer basically is where you would provide end-to-end security. And it was deemed most appropriate when the internet was designed that the session is part of the application. The application would get to decide how much security was involved. The problem, as we all know, is without a session layer, it becomes difficult to control security and privacy. The same with presentation. Constructs like video coding or audio coding may not be compatible end to end, and therefore cause problems. So the very reasonable choices were made when the internet was designed to neglect these 2 layers. Probably my guess is because they were very costly to implement in terms of machine cycles, and the systems that were being used at that time, mostly DEC PDP-8s, were very limited in their machine cycle resources. But then it also made some sense that session and presentation layer would be part of the application and not part of the network. So we're going to be talking about how standards relate to these OSI layers, and more broadly, how standards relate to communications. So here's a big jump. Apologies. This is kind of drinking from the fire hose. Here is a layering of history. So I jumped from a layering of standards to a layering of standard concepts, which is the layering of history. So from prehistory on the left, where time begins, as recorded time begins, the first human activities that we could imagine, as opposed to animal activities, would be bartering, where in some way people trade back and forth to get what they don't have otherwise. And that begins to create symbols for whatever is being bartered and for whatever is being desired. So we begin to create symbol sets. And there, if you go to the paper, comes out of that Bridge paper, there are references to archaeological studies which support this layering of history. So bartering first, then around 10,000 BC is a good guess anyway. The concept of measuring emerges. Measuring really is a more sophisticated form of bartering, to being able to count or represent something with a count. And probably around 10,000 BC, it emerges because agriculture emerges around 10,000 BC. And in order to feed a population, you have to count them, plant the number of seeds in the area necessary. All these measuring activities, counting and measuring, have to emerge for agriculture to successfully feed a population. So they basically are beginning around 10,000 BC. Jumping forward to 3000 BCE, the concept of building. It's amazing to me that the 7 wonders of the world, a phrase I'm sure many have heard, talks about designs. This was not the Grand Canyon or Mount Everest or the eigenhorn or some other beautiful natural phenomena. It was designs. The idea that humans could plan something and it would occur was a wonder. So a new concept emerges with measurements, basically, and symbols that you can create a plan that can be implemented. And you can build these marvelous edifices that we consider wonders of the world at that time and still do, by virtue of creating designs. So these first three layers of history, symbols, measurement, and design, they're really references. There's nobody who calls these standards at this point in time. They're too basic for that. They're things that we reference. The symbols themselves, the measurements, and even the plans that those measurements represent are just references, but very important ones. So somewhere around 1400, similarity standards start to emerge. 1400 turns out to be an interesting period. Perspective drawing was just emerging in northern Italy, and particularly around Venice, Florence, Rome, those areas. There are notable artists who were, and an artist in that point in time was a very bright person who was both mathematical, science, art, all those things merged together. And so around that same period, 1400, the Arsenal in Venice, Italy, actually founded in the late, beginning to emerge really in the late 1300s, starts building galleys for the purpose of trade in the Mediterranean. Again, the concept of trade is a very powerful concept, really expanding on our bartering, measuring, and building concepts. And trade becomes the way of creating enormous wealth. What's interesting in the Arsenale in Venice in 1400 is in Corsica, which is a similar latitude place, you could build a galley a year. In Venice, they were building one galley a week at this point in time, soon to become one galley a day. They were capable of doing. It was the most advanced manufacturing in the world. If you like, it was the Silicon Valley of the 1400s. They had pioneered, and they didn't know it. There's nobody who writes about their great work on standards. But that's exactly what they did. They standardized the shapes of the rudders, the shapes of the ribs, the shapes of the timbers on the sides, the shapes of the masts. They standardized everything, and they had separate groups working on each part, and then all those parts could come together in a plan. And the people who made these plans, interestingly enough, tended to be the ship's captains. If the ship's captain was very successful in his running of the ships, then he was considered the right person to run the design of the ships, the manufacturing of the ships. And various ships were in fact designed by various ships' captains, and it was considered an important role to work for the right captain. So you were working on the particular building of the standard parts for that particular ship's manufacture. And this was an incredible source of wealth. The Medicis, the wealthiest people in the world, basically were running the Arsenal, that family. And so that's the beginning of similarity standards, where we make things similar, and it has enormous value to it. So next up on the layering of history, compatibility. When we have similarity, the next step really is to relate two things. So these days we have a transmitter and we might have two transmitters that are similar. They send the same signals. But in order to have compatibility, we need a receiver that receives the same signals. The receiver is totally different than the transmitter, but it is closely related, and we call that relationship compatibility. That's basically the business of the information age. And those networks really emerged in the 1800s, way before what we think of as the information age, because the first networks were railroads. And the gauge of the railroad determined compatibility, whether the trains could run on the tracks or not. The engineers tended to design networks of rail with engineering requirements in mind. If you were moving loads over rocky areas with lots of elevation change, you tended to make the rails close together. If you were moving loads over flat plains, you tended to make the rails further apart. That made engineering sense to do that, but it did not further compatibility. And so here we see kind of the beginning conflicts between compatibility and engineering. The engineering requirements of similarity conflict with the desire for trading of that compatibility represents. And then now I suggest that around 2000, the concept of openness starts to emerge, and we are looking for adaptability. We have things that are compatible, but we now want them to be adaptable so they're compatible with other things. Our cell phone is an excellent example of this because it can operate over the various different, group 1, group 2, GSM, the cellular 5, cellular 4, so forth, all the different versions of cellular. It can even operate over Wi-Fi networks. It can operate over European frequency bands, or US or North American frequency bands, or Asian frequency bands. So it's very adaptable. And that's where we are now, creating more and more adaptable things. And interestingly enough, the concepts of standards have not kept up with this. We're still thinking about standards as if they were similarity, and much less about compatibility, and very little about adaptability, even though it happens. So to be a little more precise about this concept of similarity and compatibility, so as you can see on the left, plug 1 and plug 2, they are similar. They may well be equal, or equal within a tolerance. And socket 1 and socket 2, again, are similar or equal within a tolerance. But it's the relationship between the plug and the socket, which is really the outline of the plug and the inside of the socket. That relationship is the compatibility relationship. Totally different, but absolutely related. If you think about this in terms of Venn diagrams, then plug 1 and plug 2 are one circle, the standard for plug 1 and plug 2. And there's another circle which represents the standard for socket 1 and socket 2. And then the overlap of those two standards, where the two circles of the Venn diagram overlap, represents compatibility. So big difference. It's worth talking about this difference in some detail because it's not really well seen and understood. As Gillette blades, if you're familiar with the Gillette razor from a number of years ago, it was a blue blade that you saw, which had a strange series of cutouts, little triangles and squares and slots in the center of it. And you might ask yourself, why did those cutouts occur? But what caused that strange shape of cutouts? And it's a fun story. Mr. Gillette pioneered a very important concept, which is well understood, which is give away the razor and sell the blade. And so by doing that, he was basically relying on the fact that the particular razor that he gave away required a certain blade that he could sell. Well, needless to say, he started out, and this new way of shaving turned out to be a marketing success. People liked it, so competition emerged. And so the first thing a competitor would do would be to make a compatible blade, and there are actually ads which show this, where the razor manufacturers, the blade manufacturers said, my blade is compatible with the Gillette razor. Now, Mr. Gillette, then realizing that he was losing business to his competitors, because they could price their blades cheaper because they didn't have to give away the razors, made changes to the shape of compatibility, the shape of those little openings in the blade, between the blade and the razor. Now, he tried, in fact, first he had some patents, but his patents were initially on the process of sharpening and maintaining the temper of the blade, and he had some excellent designs there, which worked very well, but it was hard for people to perceive that technological change. And so if somebody else said, my blade is as sharp as a Gillette blade, and it was cheaper, there was a tendency to buy the cheaper one. So one of the things that Gillette did was he filed a trademark on the shape of his blade, or tried to. It turned out the trademark office, first, because it was nothing more than a circle, which is where the bolt went in, and two slots. They rejected that as trademarkable. It was too simple. And that's where we start now to see the changes that occurred in the blade shape as Mr. Gillette made his new razors more and more complex to fit a more and more complex shape of blade. And finally, he got a blade shape that the trademark office agreed was trademarkable, and then he was able to control his market. It's interesting, but you'll see in business school courses, they discuss that the concept of Gillette having offered the new idea, then new idea of giving away the razor and selling the blade, but they do not discuss the fact that in order to make that happen, he had to control the standard. And he did that ultimately by trademark. In this case, standard meaning his standard, which would more properly be called specification. So to take this forward to something we're more familiar with today, an applications programming interface, API. An API is a compatibility standard. It's quite different because it has no physical representation at all. It's merely a series of program statements that operate to allow other software entities to interact. But that compatibility is required nonetheless. And that is how, in fact, today, Google controls the interface to their various software systems, how Facebook controls the interface to their various software systems. And if you don't do what Google or Facebook or Amazon or whoever expects you to do, you can be removed from access to that API. A very powerful way to control your market. The way large companies control their market. So this concept of compatibility and market control is very closely tied together. So let's look at this adaptability stuff. One more concept here that we talked about earlier in the history of standards. In the 7 OSI layers, basically with the internet, we have TCP, UDP, and IP layers 4 and 3, and they can work below that with network discovery protocols to see what's out there. So my computer can go looking for various accessories across an API using a network discovery protocol, and see if there's a printer and see if there's a network, et cetera, et cetera. And service discovery protocols can operate above the TCP UDP layer to see what services applications are available, right? Including security and presentation layer applications, functions. So this is how adaptability would be created, or is created. Now, the thing that's going on here is there is huge economic effects. Similarity increases efficiency. To try to make an example of that, let's go back in time to the late 1800s, maybe even mid 1800s, and talk about barrel standards. A barrel, which is made up of a bunch of curved sheaves of wood, bound with rings of steel or iron, has a particular shape to it. It also contains a certain volume, so we can specify a barrel by its volume. So we could specify it in terms of liters, we could specify it in terms of gallons, 2 different measurement systems. But we could also specify the barrel in terms of its shape. What is the diameter of the barrel? What is the height of the barrel? What is the maximum weight of the barrel, et cetera, et cetera. And these other standards of barrels can become quite important. And let's look at that in enough detail to understand the importance of similarity. If we make the barrel diameter the same, then it turns out that if I have a wagon, I can introduce into the base of the wagon circular cutouts where the barrel fits. And in this way, I can strap down a set of barrels really with one strap over each barrel, because the bottom is held in the circular cutout on the base of my wagon. This means I can load and unload barrels quite a bit faster than someone who has to strap down each barrel with at least 2 straps. Next, of course, the barrel goes to the bar, and the bartender can do the same thing. In the bar, he can have a circular cutout where we put the barrel into the cutout, and we don't strap it down at all. It's quite solid there, just being held by its weight. We put the tap in the bunghole, and we use the barrel to serve liquids at the bar. And so the bar and bartender becomes part of a system of similarity, which controls the manufacturing of the barrel. What's the diameter? And that, of course, means that my hoops can all be the same size. That means that I can make my sheaves the same size. And this is pretty much the same as happened in Venice in 1400. Making the galleys the same allowed me to make them much more quickly. And so I've got manufacturing effects that similarity creates great efficiencies. I've got distribution effects that similarity creates great efficiencies. And I've got even use effects that similarity creates great efficiencies. So similarity, as it emerged, which is really the beginning of the industrial age. If you think about manufacturing, the industrial age, it's not about steam engines or any of those kind of things. It's really about similar standards. Once you create similar standards, you get enormous efficiencies. It's true that new power systems were hugely valuable, but really manufacturing is based upon making things the same over and over again. And that's where the efficiency was. So similarity drove the development of the industrial age as much as anything did. What we call the information age is really driven by compatibility. The economists use the term network effects, which talks about the idea that basically that when Alexander Graham Bell sold the phone, he had to sell two of them. One was to a doctor, the first phone, one was to a doctor and the other was to a pharmacist. And the doctor could ring up the pharmacist and the pharmacist would fill the prescription. And that was the very first phone commercial usage. So if you were a second pharmacist, you did not want a phone that didn't work with the first phone. You wanted to talk to that doctor. If you were a second doctor, you wanted to talk to the other pharmacy. And so this is called network effects, where the leader of the network tends to dominate the network, a la Amazon, a la Google, a la Facebook, Zoom, etc. If you can find a network which has real market value and you can lead it, you can dominate it and therefore gain great economic value. So the point to make is that adaptability standards, which are just really a concept that's quite new, and people don't understand the economic effect of adaptability standards, can allow for a segmentation of markets. So you can decide, well, I'll be a different phone system because it does something better, but I will also be backward compatible with the other phone system. And that concept of backward compatibility is the beginnings of adaptable mechanisms. So here it's worth talking a little bit more about how this similarity, compatibility, and adaptability is playing out in the world today. The European Union thinks of standardization pretty much as similarity standards. And they are interested in standards because there's 20 plus countries and they're looking to economically integrate them. And so it'd be very nice if the safety standards or the standards for food processing or the standards for cars or whatever standards it were similar across each of these different countries. And traditionally, each country made its own standards. And now, of course, in a globalized world, such activity is being minimized. But we're really going back to the 1400s when the galleys that were made the same were the galleys that were made in one city-state, Venice. So the EU desires economic integration, mostly focusing on similarity standards. The US considers standards to be a commercial activity, interestingly enough. And therefore, the government tries not to become involved in standardization, except to the extent that it's necessary for some public good, health, safety, etc. Perhaps we need standards for cryptocurrencies, as example. Maybe there is some desire there. Obviously, that's to be determined. China now, on the other hand, is an emerging huge market, of course, where, like many developing countries, they have been hurt in their perspective by standardization in the West. If you go around the countries of Africa or South America or Asia that are developing, you'll find that they have gone through a number of years, most of the last century, basically, struggling with standards that were imposed on them by the West. We won't buy your grain unless it meets this safety requirement or this chemical requirement, or we won't buy your grain unless it's packaged in this way, or the humidity is maintained at this level. All these standards start to emerge, which are very important, but they're put upon the developing countries. They come out of nowhere, sadly, because nobody teaches that standards are fundamental to almost everything, to probably everything. And therefore, the developing countries thought that they had good grain or good fruit or whatever it was. And then they're told, no, it has to meet this standard. And so many developing countries find standards to be a form of market control. And not surprisingly, when they get to have their own standards, like China is now capable of doing, they like to practice market control to get back at the people who dinged it to them. The cellular standards of previous generations were all created by Western countries. And now with China being active in the development of the current generation of cellular standards, they are being pushed back by the West, saying, no, we don't want you to be dominant in these standards. We liked it much better when we were dominant in these standards. So this idea that the US has of standards as a commercial activity is a little bit two-faced. Yes, standards are a commercial activity in the US, and that makes a lot of sense, but they have very serious economic impacts on countries. And to think otherwise is unfortunate. So here you have three major, huge marketplaces in the world, the EU, China, and the US, each of whom think of standards in a very, very different way. None of whom understand the difference between similarity, compatibility, and the need for more adaptability. And we start to see trade issues emerge. Sadly, there may be many reasons for trade issues to emerge. I can't speak to all of them. I can only speak to the ones that relate to standards and standardization. And in that area, trying to use standards as a club in each different area for your own particular market view is a mistake. It doesn't represent the best value for any of these countries. So maybe we'll kind of finish up here a little bit with some isology terms. So a reference is a basis for comparison. We have them all over the place. They exist everywhere, and they're just a basis for comparison. A standard is a codified and quantified reference imposed by an authority, government, committee, market, something. And this, there's an economist, Friedrich Hayek, a very famous Austrian economist, his book, Rules and Order, 1973. I love to point out that in the book called Rules and Order, the word standard is never used. To give you an idea of just how difficult it is for people to think about how these standards actually operate. But his book on Rules and Order does a very good job of explaining how you create order, which really means using standards, codified and quantified references. Standardization is a very tricky term. If I am Microsoft and I create the word processing program Word, I am the creator of a specification, the proper name, that specifies the word processing program. But on the other hand, I might be a developer who wants to implement some application, some mathematical symbolism that Word doesn't have, at least it didn't have a number of years ago. And now I use Word APIs and I implement my own process to add mathematical symbols to the word processing program. And then you could go to some user in the early days of word processing and say, are you going to use the word processing program from Microsoft? And they say, well, we had a committee meeting and we've looked at a number of different word processing programs and we've standardized in our company on using Word. So very different views of creating, implementing, or using standard is standardization. making conversation on the subject very treacherous. I think I'm going to rush through some of this stuff. This is rules in order, established by, how order occurs, the term. What's interesting to me here is there is so many words on this page. We think standards are a really big deal. And we add all kinds of words, most of which are not well defined and cause great confusion. But there they are. So one worthwhile idea that's worth bringing up here is standardization. We start with the idea up here. I've got a brilliant idea, and so we can talk about standardizing anticipatory before there is a product or service. The idea comes up here at 12 o'clock. The product or service is here at 6 o'clock. So we can decide to standardize beforehand. And if you were building a telephone network and you have to run wires, you have to agree on the wires before you make the network. And so anticipatory standards are, if you will, OSI layer 1, the first layer of the system you have to agree on before anything happens. The lovely thing about the IETF was they created participatory standardization, where they standardize using two references, where, of course, you couldn't do that if you were standardizing the wires. That doesn't work. Participatory standardization only is possible above layer 1 and layer 2 of the OSI model. And then finally, responsive standardization. ISO has been a big leader in that. None of these standards organizations understand their history in this sense, but they have basically followed it. The ISO being originally getting its big efforts to standardize computer standards when IBM was dominant in the industry. Okay, I think I'm going to stop here because we're just running short of time, and we need to leave a little bit of time for questions. Jessica, over
Perfect.
to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciated not only the history lesson, because that is so helpful when you're having a meeting and trying to advocate for standards, as well as all of the really helpful diagrams. I've been live tweeting it, so hopefully some folks have enjoyed it there. The first question that I had is a little bit fanciful, but if you had a magic wand and could pick one technical industry to improve the standards in, which industry would you choose and what would you change?
Okay. I would choose biology, because DNA is the standard for life. And if we knew the 6 different layers that I described of DNA, as example, protein manufacture is almost undoubtedly similarity standard. Each protein is a similarity standard. But I don't really understand compatibility or adaptability, which occurs widely in DNA. And of course, it's everything. It's our immune system. That's DNA being adaptable. We have these amazing drugs which have just been created to solve this COVID problem, vaccinations. And they are basically changing the adaptability of my DNA. So that if I had my magic wand, I would see that area allow so much more health and well-being in people.
Awesome. So this next one is from anonymous attendee. It says, thank you for providing context for standards. What is the best way for technical and non-technical people to engage in developing and championing standards? And if I may take the privilege, could you also recommend some professional organizations that attendees could join that would help them develop themselves as standards professionals?
Well, big plug for SFBay ISOC. Our favorite organization. And honestly, I joined SFBay ISOC for that reason. I wanted to help develop standards and standardization. It's hugely important. The big issue that I'm really concerned about these days is Huawei. If I'm giving it a little bit of history, in 1980s, let's say, where I was active in standards then, AT&T dominated in the West, which was most of all compatibility standardization, all the standardization work. Well, almost all the standardization work. They're people, many of them very, very fine technical people, were chairs of various committees, active on various committees, so forth and so on. In 1984, we had divestiture, which destroyed this amazing edifice, which was AT&T, and had a number of advantages and had some significant disadvantages. One of which was Justice Green, who presided over the divestiture, had no idea what a standard meant. And so he said, oh, Lucent can have all the standards that AT&T has. Well, it turns out that AT&T had offered as a public utility these standards for free when I was sitting in the room and saying, which technology should we use? I'd say, oh, well, it's free. We should use that. Let's do that. And then Justice Green says, well, it used to be free, but now it's not. You have to pay for it. So that was a case where, by not understanding the concept of standards in the legal profession, a tremendous amount of public wealth was privatized, which made Lucent, I'm sure, and their lawyers very happy, but probably did not make everybody else very happy. So the idea that standardization is fundamental, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're a politician, we need to explain that almost everywhere. And other than the course you see here, there is no one else talking about it. I lecture at University of Colorado, which to correct you just slightly, Jessica, is called CU. To avoid the obvious conflict.
Oh, it's Connecticut. Connecticut always calls them UCs. I have all these friends. They're like, oh, I go to UC, and I'm like,
Colorado has been very cautious about this. I doubt if it has anything to do with the fact that I live in California. But I do lecture in Colorado and I used to go and fly there, and now blessings of Zoom, I can just do it this way. So there's very little information on this subject. You can take physics classes and the instructor will say, if asked, what's a meter? And he'll say it's arbitrary. He or she will say it's arbitrary. It is totally unarbitrary.
No, it's the distance that light takes in a vacuum. There's a very specific ruling on it. And there's like a literal meter. You can go and look at it at the standards agency.
It turns out mathematically, the issue is that every meter must be equal. Mm-hmm. You don't care what size it is, but you absolutely care that they're all equal. So the concept in physics, which is that they're arbitrary, is absolutely wrong. So it's very basic. Each of you who has been kind enough to participate, I hope you will come away with this with an idea that this could be important. I, by the way, made a very nice living as a standardization expert. Not because I'm so smart, but because there's damn few of them. So I offer this as an opportunity to any good engineer. Standardization is an excellent way to make a living because there aren't many people doing it, and very few doing it well. Jessica, go ahead.
Perfect. And I'm also going to include a quick plug for Ken's website where you can download a number of papers on this topic for anonymous attendee. Another question, if someone wished to develop a standard for cryptocurrencies, what groups should someone contact? So if you were, let's say you are a young engineer and you are involved in a cryptocurrency focused startup and you're like, I just heard this great presentation on standards. I think this is something we should get started with. And you, Ken, are their mentor. What
Right.
do you advise them to do as a 1 month thing, as a 1 year thing, as a 10-year thing? What steps should
That is
they take to help change that entire
tough,
industry? It
tough,
is a
tough
tough one.
question.
I don't ask
Um,
easy questions.
right.
You want
Yes,
easy
tough.
questions, go to
Very
Disneyland.
good question. So yeah, it's pretty sure that when we actually see some cryptocurrency have a widely supported standard, that's going to be a very valuable cryptocurrency. So first things we can tell is, there aren't any standards, are there? That I know of. Maybe there are, but none that I've seen. You can think of standards kind of in the hockey stick kind of marketing model, which is you have a new technology and it kind of goes along at a low level, and then all of a sudden it takes off. That point where it takes off, there was a standard created. That's the game. So you can use that hockey stick model to tell whether or not you shouldn't be investing, really. Um, is this technology ready for prime time? Only if it's got a standard that's pretty, looking like it's going to get widely accepted. Now, in the case of cryptocurrency, is that standard going to come out of technical side? My guess, and big underline on guess, is because this is not a field I claimed any advanced knowledge in, would be it's not going to come from the technical side. It's going to come from banking, credit, somewhere, government, somewhere in that side is going to want to standardize this form. When El Salvador basically says we support Bitcoin, what does that mean? It would be interesting to see what they wrote, what they call Bitcoin in their various documents that says that. That might be the beginnings of something. A country saying we're going to accept this as currency. So that would be where I would look. And as I say, it may not. This may have very little to do with technical issues. Cryptocurrencies could easily be unrelated to technical issues. If you look at the concepts of Bitcoin as example, it's horrible. To do this kind of processing in order to assure reliability is insanity. It doesn't scale. And of course, many people know that. And there's been all sorts of, quote, solutions. All those solutions basically fragment the value. And so what we have at the moment looks to me to be way more speculation than value. And so my point is kind of simple. When the standards emerge, you'll start to see value, not speculation. But the price of something is impossible to determine whether that price relates to speculation or that price relates to value. That there is
I'd love to
no
see a paper on that has that hockey stick graph, because that's such a compelling moment. I remember there was a paper from a grad student in Oxford who went through and hand coded like thousands and thousands of copyrighted works and figured out how many of them made money at all, which was 20%, how many of them made money more than 14 years after the initial copyright, which was 20% of that group, which meant that the entire edifice of international copyright law was designed to protect 5% of all created works. And 95% of it had no more value than if it would be stuck with the 1709 Statute of Anne. That all of the progress and all of the, well, one might call it progress or one might not, on copyright and on standards on how we manage intellectual property in that way was to benefit that 5%. And there was an
right.
entire generation of copyleft activists who were really excited by that exact moment.
Well,
But
but the
yeah,
point of it is that those models, those economic models, just the same as the lottery,
yeah,
um, represent enormous motivation.
yep.
So it's true that we pay the managers of companies ridiculous amounts of money. Certainly, they're not worth that. But that value is a motivator to so many other people to try to go up the ladder of some company.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, very last question. So one of the standards that most lay people have experience in living through several generations of changes are USB ports and consumer electrical plugs, at least if you move from country. So one is an example of a temporal change that we've all lived through several iterations of USB ports.
Right.
And many of us who travel internationally have lived through the complex mix of standards for electrical ports. I was hoping you could talk through a little bit of the history and if there are any future changes that we could expect in those kinds of tools.
Well, of course, electrical cords. We went to the unsymmetrical AC out the plugs where one is wide and one is narrow, with the idea of this is NEC, National Electric Code in this country. Mm-hmm. Basically to be able to control the ground side, for the return side from the distribution side, separate from ground. And that idea is very useful. It basically resulted in all of our sensing outlets, which will stop if they sense the current flowing the wrong way. Mm-hmm. So they can only do that if you know which way the current flows. And when in the old two-prong outlets, you couldn't tell. It went whichever way, nobody cared. So that bit of history is relatively recent, so certainly in my lifetime. Originally, nation states pioneered different outlets because the manufacturing organizations, the electrical manufacturers in each country, wanted to control the market in their country.
Yep.
And so the French outlet was different than the English outlet, which was different than the German outlet, etc. By the way, the same happened with railway gauges. Mm-hmm. The French railway gauge was different than the German railway gauge, was different than the Spanish railway gauge, so that troop trains could not run from one invading country to the other.
Yeah.
So this idea of similarity, we're now talking about similarity standards used for control, both government control as well as market control, is a very old idea. And the area here that people need to work on is to avoid market control unless it's desirable. Yeah. As example, going back to our cryptocurrency, if I am a cryptocurrency purveyor of some kind, and I can create a standard that I can control, the economic opportunities are way too interesting for me to be altruistic. I want that control. You don't see Facebook saying, oh, everybody would like to use our applications, so here's our API. We promise to keep it for everyone forever. Not going to happen. Facebook finds way too much value in controlling that API. And even better, since it's software, if you try to copy it, they'll just make a change.
Yep.
And so you can't copy it because it changes if you do. Much easier than the problem Mr. Gillette had. But definitely the exact same problem.
Yep.
So this is how these control issues emerge. We're now struggling with compatibility control. It turns out that the pharmaceutical industry thinks patents are the greatest thing, because they spend billions of dollars having to test people and try out drugs and do the various things to keep the people safe while they're trying out these drugs. Enormously complex and scary, high insurance, high control issues. Everything's expensive, and so they spend this enormous amount of effort to try to produce a drug, which we want them to produce. It helps us, saves lives. But it's very hard to do. And the purpose of a patent then is to give them some control of that drug, that chemical, the process that makes that chemical, some control over it for the next 20 years. And that gives them enough incentive. It's the 5% game. Only 5% of their drugs make it to value too, but they're incentivized, so they try. Now, on the other hand, the computer industry finds patents on APIs or control of APIs to be very difficult in some cases. Obviously,
and this was the topic of last week's
thinks that's a great idea. But if you have a patent on some sort of cellular system, and your name is Huawei, then there's a lot of people who think that's a terrible, terrible thing. You would have a patent in that. So we need to have a patent system which is more favorable to patents on compatibility, is more lax, I should say, on compatibility. Maybe a patent on similarity is 20 years and a patent on compatibility is 10 years. I don't know. But when we have a claim in a patent that reads on compatibility, there is a strong sense in my mind that that claim should have a different measure than a claim that reads on similarity.
It's a really interesting fulcrum point to modify the rubric by which patents are judged to encourage more standardization as a way of increasing innovation and overall compatibility work. That's a really cool innovation.
Yeah. When you start to see the theory, you start to get all kinds of interesting ideas about how to apply the practice. When you don't know the theory, practice is really tough. Anyway,
absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time. And that was really excellent. I'm going to move us over really quick. I'm going to show everybody what our next tech policy presentation will be. This will be in August. Like many folks, we are taking July off from the tech policy talks. It is going to be Ask the ACLU with Nicole A. Ozer, who's Technology and Civil Liberties Director for the ACLU of California. Unlike our usual ones, that will be from 1 to 2 p.m. You can register for that on our website at sfbayisoc.org/upcoming. I'm pretty sure everybody who signed in today is already a member, but you can join our chapter for free at sfbayisoc.org and then click join in the upper right-hand corner. So thank you again so much, Ken, for your wisdom and ideas, and we very much look forward to hearing from you again. And any final words you'd like to share with our audience?
Thank you all for taking your time to listen to me prattle on about my favorite subject.
Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. And to folks who have attended, this entire recording will be up on our YouTube channel sometime today. Thank you so much, Ken. I'm going to close the presentation now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a great day.